We're continuing this morning our Focused and Alive series. Focused and Alive, living in the light of forever. The message this morning and the message next Sunday will both come from the text that we're using this morning, Ephesians 5, verses 1 through 20. We are expecting that Pastor Glenn he and Viola will fly in tomorrow and be back with us then beginning Tuesday. And this bronchitis that he's had, he tells me is a lot better. We'll see when he gets back. We've got leadership team retreat next weekend, so you can be in prayer for Glenn as he returns and gets back into things. You'll need your Bibles this morning, and I invite you to find the text of Ephesians 5, 1 through 20, and we'll be going some other places as well. But I'd like to begin this morning with this question, and the question being, did you ever lose something and not know that it was missing? Did you ever lose something and then not know that it was missing? Well, shortly after Vivian and I were married, the fire trucks rolled past our house and over the viaduct bridge and were making their way outside of town. And I got one of those feelings that we sometimes get, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. And based on that unsettled feeling, I grabbed a coat, jumped in the car. It was winter time, and I headed for my parents' farm, which was just a couple of miles outside of town. When I came over the last hill, I could see that their two-car extended garage and the building behind it were fully engulfed in flames, and those buildings sat just about 10 feet from the house. The house was saved with minimal amount of damage, but the garage was a complete loss, and for insurance purposes, we were asked to make a list of everything that had been in the garage when it burned. And I don't know how your recollection is, but there's some things you can remember, and there's a few pieces of things in the ash and so forth, and so you put some of those things together. But we put the list together the best that we could. But for weeks, for months, and for even years, we would find ourselves hunting for something, not be able to find it, and then realize, oh, okay, it must have burned in the garage as well. Did you ever lose something and not know that it was missing? Well, in another setting, Orville and Arliss Cox were members of our church family at the Central United Brethren Church in Montpelier, and one Sunday evening they loaded up their van with their kids, as was usual after the evening service, and Orville returned about 10 minutes later with kind of a silly grin on his face to retrieve another child that was still sleeping in the back bench. They had gotten home and made a count of their kids and found that they were one short. They had started out with 5. When they got home, they only had 4. So Orville came back to the church building to find the missing child. Well, still in another setting, partners in marriage sometimes express a similar experience. Persons sometimes wake up to the realization that they've lost the love that they once held for each other, that they've unknowingly been slowly moving in different directions. They're really not sure when love slipped out of their lives, but they one day wake up to the realization that somehow love is just not there. Love is missing. Did you ever lose something and not know that it was missing? Well, the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus, and the church of Ephesus was one of 7 churches, the 7 churches of Asia, written about in the book of Revelation. If you would turn to Revelation chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. Revelation chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And while you're making your way to that text, let me say that what we know is that John was on the island of Patmos. He was there because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And church tradition tells us that John had been exiled to this small island, a penal colony, a place where they often worked in the mines. He was there to shut him up so that he wouldn't be speaking about the ways of Christ and he wouldn't be teaching in the ways of the faith. So John is on the Isle of Patmos. It's the Lord's Day, and John is in the Spirit. And as John is in the Spirit, Jesus begins to speak to him, telling him to write down what he sees and what he hears. And so it's amazing to me that John is persecuted, and tradition has it that they tried to kill him, and when they couldn't succeed in killing him, that they took him and exiled him out here to this island, putting him out here where he couldn't speak to people, where he couldn't bring the Word of God. And yet God meets him there, brings about the book of Revelation, and Rome is brought under the fire of God's Word by the fact that John was exiled. And so how many of you know this morning that the Word of God cannot be shut up or put off? And so God brings the Word forth from John on the Isle of Patmos. And John writes, in God's Word says, beginning with verse 1, to the angel, and that is to the messenger, of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars. Now we understand that the 7 stars are the 7 angels or the 7 messengers that are going to be bringing or delivering this message. And in his right hand, those 7 stars are in his right hand, and he walks among the 7 golden lampstands, and that's the 7 churches. And we know that because Jesus gives those interpretations to us in chapter 1, verse 20. And Jesus says, I know your deeds. I know your deeds. I know your hard work and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, and that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and have not grown weary. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand. That is, I will remove your church from its place. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So there were a lot of things that Jesus commends the church of Ephesus for. They were hardworking, they were persevering, they didn't tolerate the wicked people, they didn't weary in this work that God had for them. There were many things that were commendable about the church at Ephesus. But somewhere along the way, they lost their first love. They lost their first love. Somewhere along the way, they just started going through the motions, probably doing a lot of the right things, but really not having a heart after doing those things, not really having the right motives in their hearts for doing those things. And they just went through the motions, and no one seems to have noticed except for God. And God says, you have forsaken the love you had at first. So consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things that you did at first. Return. So how can we hold tight to our first love for God? How can we keep our first love from God from slipping away like love so often slips away? Well, the first words that we hear coming from the text this morning are these. The first 3 words are the first 3 words of verse 1 from Ephesians. And those words are these: follow God's example. Follow God's example. Now, if we back up one verse, Ephesians 4:32, if we back up one verse, Paul has just instructed the church to be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. And if we move forward one verse, Paul continues to instruct the church, and he says to walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So we can know that we are holding tight to our first love for God when we are forgiving each other just as Christ has forgiven us. In fact, we can know that we are holding tight to our first love for God when we are giving ourselves up for one another, just as Christ gave himself up for us. Turn with me, if you would, to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. If you just a minute to turn there. Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, look at the opening two verses. Jesus is surrounded by two groups of people. Jesus is surrounded by the tax collectors and sinners. They're there, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law are there. Two groups of people. And Luke tells us that the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. Isn't it amazing the tax collectors and sinners were drawn to Jesus? They weren't put off by Jesus, they were drawn to Jesus. And they come to Jesus to hear what Jesus is having to say. But Luke tells us that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were there for a different purpose. They came to mutter against Jesus. They were muttering, and they said, this man, being Jesus, welcomes sinners. Not only does he welcome sinners, but he even eats with them. So that's the take of Jesus from the view of the Pharisees. So beginning with verse 3 to the end of the chapter, Jesus tells three parables that are aimed not at the tax collectors and sinners, but three parables that are aimed directly at the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. In verses 3 through 7, Jesus tells them the parable of the lost sheep, and Jesus says that there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And in verses 8 through 10, Jesus tells them the parable of the lost coin, and again ends by saying there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. But it was the third parable in verses 11 through 32 that had the Pharisees kicking the dust. Now, most of us know the third parable as the parable of the lost son, but I think if you really dig into the teaching of Jesus in this parable, you'll discover that it's the parable of the lost sons in the plural. Both sons were far away from God. Now, we understand quickly that the first son was far away from God. I mean, he takes what he can get from the father. He leaves the father and goes off into this distant country. And in that distant country, he squanders his wealth in wild living. His brother says he spends his wealth on prostitutes, which is likely the truth. This is the son that we recognize as being far away from God. But the second son is just as far away from God as his younger brother. Now, to all appearances, the older brother did everything right. I mean, he's the one who stayed home, right? He's the one who continued to run the family farm in the absence of his younger brother, who's run off to do all this wild living. He's the one who obeys his father's orders. He's the one that the Pharisees standing there would have applauded. He'd kept the law. He'd done the right things, but Jesus reveals the heart of the older brother. And the heart that Jesus reveals is a heart that's far away from God. You see, the younger brother gets so low in life that he repents and he returns to the father. The younger son knows that he's made a mess out of his life. He knows that, and the younger son knows that he doesn't even deserve to come back to his father and to serve as a servant or a general laborer there. On the other hand, the older brother believes that his father owes him. His father owes him everything. Why? Because he's been good. He's the one that stayed behind. He's the one that's worked the family farm. He's done all these things. He didn't run off and squander the family's money. He thinks the father owes him. He's done all of this for the father, he thinks. But the things he did were not done for the father. The things he did were only done for himself. He has a selfish heart. If his work had been done for the Father, then he would have rejoiced when the Father rejoiced. But because his heart was as selfish as his wild, living younger brother, he refuses to go in to the party. Even when his father pleads with him, the older son just turns away. You see, both brothers left the father. The first left the father in doing all the wrong things, and the second one left the father in doing all the right things. The first was overcome by his sin. He knew that he was a sinner, and he returns to the father. The second couldn't even see his sin, and so he refuses the father's love. The father pleaded with both sons to come home. Jesus pleaded with the tax collectors and the sinners to come home, and they came home. And Jesus pleaded with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law to come home, and they hated Jesus, and they called for his crucifixion. You know, it's hard to forgive when we've not experienced forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't for the faint of heart. Forgiveness doesn't come easy. Forgiveness isn't natural. It's supernatural. It comes from Christ. Some of the things of this life indeed are terribly hard, are they not? Life can be hard. Some of the things that this life just seems impossible that we could forgive. Some of the people of this life should never be forgiven. And we are those people. You see, once we were not a people, but now we are a people of God. Once we had not received mercy, but now we have received mercy. We are those people, but by the grace of God, we have received that mercy from God. And God calls us to follow his example and to forgive others as he has forgiven us. In the words of Timothy Keller, if, like the older brother, you believe God ought to bless you and help you because you have worked so hard, because you've worked so hard to obey him and to be a good person, if you think God owes you because of that, then Jesus may be your helper. He may be your example. He may even be your inspiration. But he's not your Savior. You are serving as your own Savior. So we can know that we are holding tight to our first love for God when we are forgiving each other just as Christ has forgiven us. In fact, we can know that we are holding tight to our first love for God when we are giving ourselves up for one another just as Christ gave himself up for us. But when we refuse to come to the Father's party, we can know that it's not the Father that we love, but ourselves. First love forgives as we have been forgiven. First love recognizes that we too are prodigals, saved only by the grace of God and intended to share that same grace with others. Now, most of you are aware that I have a son who's been in prison now for approximately 8-9 years. And Dan will get out in about a year and a half or a year and 3/4, something like that. That's a long time to spend in prison, right? And so pretty easy to say, well, Dan's a prodigal, and you'd be right. Dan's a prodigal. And then the realization is, but then his dad's a prodigal too. And from that, the realization that prodigals are the only people that God has. We're all prodigals. some who are still far away from God, some who have received God, and our lives have been transformed and changed. But we're all prodigals, and God's grace and mercy is extended to us. It's extended to us, and none of us deserve it. And none of us deserve it. Follow God's example. Hold tight to your first love and let your, secondly, hold tight to your first love and let your life flow with thanksgiving. The next section of our text is running over with things that are not to be a part of our lives. Look at Ephesians 5. Verses 3 through 7. Ephesians 5, verses 3 through 7. Paul says, "But among you, that is the holy people of God, among you there must not even be a hint, not even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be partners with them." Verses 3 and 4 are running over literally with things that are not to be a part of our lives as we serve Christ. And verses 5 through 7 spell out the consequences of having those things in our lives. In verses 3 and 4, one negative follows the next. And then, tucked away at the end of verse 4, Paul gives us three words. Three words that don't seem to fit in with the rest of the list that's there. The first three words were follow God's example. The next three words are these, but rather thanksgiving. But rather thanksgiving, tucked in right at the end of verse 4. Rather than being sexually immoral, rather than being impure, rather than being greedy, let your hearts flow with God's thanksgiving. Rather than giving ourselves to obscenity, rather than giving ourselves to foolish talk, rather than giving ourselves to coarse joking, we are to give ourselves to thanksgiving. By the Spirit of God, thanksgiving, which is the worship of God, will push these other things out of our lives, these things that Paul says are improper, these things that are out of place for God's holy people. Now let me take us to verse 5. Look carefully at verse 5. God's word says, "For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God." You see those 6 little words in the middle of the verse? Such a person is an idolater. So you see, when we engage in sexual immorality, when we engage in impurity, when we engage in greed, we are bowing down to idols. We are bowing down to other than God. When we take up obscenity, when we give ourselves to foolish talk, when we entertain ourselves with coarse joking, we're bowing down to a God other than Jesus Christ. So the question that the apostle is asking is this: to whom are you bowing down? Who is your king? Who is your Lord? Who are you worshiping? That's the question from this text. Last Sunday I shared about my childhood and teen years at the Central United Brethren Church, and about, to me as a kid it felt like it was really about do's and don'ts, and I knew about Jesus, but obviously I didn't know Jesus. And so it always felt like, well, we had these things that we should do and these things that we couldn't do, and somehow if you got those mixed up, that you just couldn't be a Christian, or you're a messed up Christian at best. And there were just those things, and certainly there are things that once we are in Christ we choose to do, and those things that we choose not to do, but it's not about a religion. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. And as long as we're following a religion, it's quite easy to leave off and to move in a different direction. But it's about relationship with Jesus Christ. It's about following and worshiping the person of Jesus Christ. It's not about a list of things that we should or shouldn't do. It's about a relationship. And when we're in that relationship, these are things that begin to fall away from our lives because they are not of Christ. When we are bowing down before Jesus Christ, we can know that we are holding on to our first love. When our hearts are filled with thanksgiving that carries us into worship, we can know that our first love is strong. So follow God's example and let your lives flow with God's thanksgiving. Now, at the time the Apostle Paul was writing, Ephesus was a great city. And it was a great city because it was right, I guess you'd say location. It was right where all the trade routes came together. So they had the best of everything that was available in their world. Not only did they have the best of the trade routes, but they had one of the greatest harbors of the world at that time. And so all the products, the imports and exports could move back and forth throughout their city. And so they had a city of great wealth, and that brought a lot of other things with it as well. When Paul was writing, you could take the Arcadian Way from the city, central part of the city, to the harbor. It was a street that served as the main thoroughfare, and you could walk that thoroughfare all the way through. That's what I'm told. I've never been to Ephesus. But I'm also told that today you can walk down that street of the ancient ruins of that city, as it would be, toward that ancient harbor. You could walk as far as that street will allow. You can look in all directions, and for the life of you, you'll not be able to see a harbor. In fact, you'll not even be able to see water. Nothing is there. Centuries of silt from the Cayster River accumulated in that harbor, one of the greatest harbors of the world, and gradually pushed the waterfront away from the city. And at first they tried to work at keeping the harbor clean, and it was a lot of work, and they just gave up. Today, the ruins of Ephesus sit about 5 miles away from the Aegean Sea. Grain after grain of silt, year after year of deposits, finally reduced a city of great influence to a city of great insignificance. And this was what was happening in the church at Ephesus. The Ephesian Christians had lost their first love by allowing the silt of spiritual indifference to accumulate over the years. It can happen to any of us. It can happen to you. It can happen to me. As believers, we never outgrow the basics. We either build on those or we abandon them. We can wake up after a number of years and discover that our lack of passion for Jesus Christ has gradually silted him 5 miles away from our hearts. And we can find ourselves living in the ruins of once very vibrant spiritual lives. So continue in your first love. And if you find your first love's not there, then take the words of Jesus and return to your first love. Repent and come back. Follow the example of God in the way of forgiveness, and flow with the thanksgiving of God in your worship. And as we come before God, and we lay that open before God, let me turn back to Psalm 139 in conclusion. Psalm 139 is a psalm rich. If you haven't included it as a part of your life, you might want to do that. But the last two verses of Psalm 139 should be the verses of our reflection today. And the psalmist says, "Search me, God, and know my heart, and test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me, Lord, in the way everlasting." May that be the prayer of our hearts this morning. Amen.